It was supposed to be over by noon. On the morning of July 2, 1863, General Robert E. Lee stood on Seminary Ridge, gazed across the rolling Pennsylvania farmland, and believed, with complete certainty, that the Union left flank was hanging in the air, unprotected, vulnerable, ripe for the taking. One scout's report. One man's word. That was all it took to set 50,000 soldiers into motion. What followed was not a swift Confederate victory. It was a catastrophe, for both sides. A day of fire, blood, miscalculation, and unimaginable courage. A day that nearly tore the Union apart, and the story begins with a single, fatal mistake. Fire on the second day. Act 1. The Ghost of Information, Morning, July 2, 1863. The general who trusted too much. The Pennsylvania sky was pale gray before sunrise when Robert E. Lee climbed Seminary Ridge on the morning of July 2, 1863. Behind him, the Army of Northern Virginia, 75,000 strong, was camped in long, dusty lines stretching south through the town of Gettysburg. The previous day had ended in Confederate triumph. Union forces had been driven through the streets, back up onto Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, but they had not broken. They had regrouped. Lee knew time was not on his side. Every hour that passed allowed Union General George Meade to bring more men forward. Lee needed to strike, decisively, ruthlessly, before Meade's Army of the Potomac settled into an unbreakable defensive line. And so, as the mist clung to the low fields below, Lee summoned his engineers and scouts for a critical question. Where exactly was the Union left flank? Captain Samuel Johnston, a trusted staff officer, rode out in the pre-dawn hours to survey the terrain. He moved carefully along the Emmitsburg Road, scanning the ridgelines through his glass. He saw no Union troops in the fields beyond the peach orchard. He saw no soldiers on the gentle slopes of Little Round Top, the rocky, wooded hill that anchored the far left end of the Union line. Or so he believed. In the gray half-light, he had missed them entirely. And when he reported back to Lee, he said the words that would ignite the bloodiest day of the battle. "General, the enemy's left is in the air. There is nothing on the Round Tops." Lee accepted the report without question. It was, after all, the report he had hoped to receive. Longstreet's protest. General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted corps commander and the man Lee privately called "my old war horse," was not convinced. Standing beside Lee on the ridge that morning, Longstreet studied the ground and felt a deep unease settle in his bones. He had fought enough battles to know when the terrain was lying to you. "General," Longstreet said quietly, "I believe we should move around the Union left, swing south, get between Meade and Washington. Force him to attack us on ground of our choosing." Lee shook his head. He had tried that plan at Second Bull Run, at Chancellorsville. Today, he felt the aggressive instinct pulling at him. The Union Army was right here. This was the moment. He pointed south along the Emmitsburg Road. "The enemy is here. We will strike him here. Longstreet, I want you to move your corps south, swing left, and hit the Union flank before it can be reinforced." Longstreet saluted, but he was unhappy. And unhappy generals, history would show, sometimes move slowly. Chapter 3, Stuart's Return and the Unraveling of Intelligence. The morning's troubles were compounded by the absence, and then the sudden return, of Jeb Stuart, Lee's cavalry commander. Stuart had spent the last week riding a grand circuit around the Union Army, trying to disrupt supply lines and gather intelligence. But his absence had left Lee functionally blind. Lee had received no reliable information about Union movements, Union numbers, or Union positions for days. When Stuart finally clattered back into the Confederate lines on the afternoon of July 2, Lee's response was one of the rare moments where witnesses reported genuine anger in the Virginian's demeanor. According to multiple accounts, Lee raised his hand and said, "General Stuart, where have you been? I have not heard from you in days. Not a word." Stuart, usually so confident, reportedly looked stricken. But there was no time for recriminations. The attack was already being prepared. The army was already in motion. Johnston's faulty reconnaissance report would stand, uncorrected, unchallenged, as the foundation upon which the Confederate assault was built. It was a house of cards, and nobody yet knew the wind was coming. Act TWO, the slow march south, late morning to early afternoon. Longstreet's delay. By mid-morning, Longstreet's corps was supposed to be moving. The plan called for his men to march south along concealed routes, behind the ridgelines and through the woods, to reach their attack positions without being spotted by Union signal stations on Little Round Top. But movement was slow. Painfully, agonizingly slow. Part of the delay was tactical. The route needed to be changed when Confederate troops crested a ridge and realized they would be visible to the Union observers. They backtracked, found another route, and marched again. The summer heat was brutal. Men stumbled in the dust. Officers shouted and urged, and the column ground forward like a reluctant serpent. Part of the delay, some historians have argued, was Longstreet himself. He did not want to make this attack. He thought it was wrong, tactically, strategically. He was a subordinate carrying out orders he disagreed with, and whether consciously or not, his pace reflected his reluctance. The attack that Lee had intended to launch at dawn would not begin until nearly 4 in the afternoon. Those hours, those precious, irretrievable hours, would cost the Confederacy dearly. The Union line and Meade's long night. While Longstreet marched, Union General George Meade was working with the focused intensity of a man who understood exactly how thin his position was. Meade had arrived at Gettysburg just hours before, on the night of July 1, taking command of an army that had been battered and was now perched on Cemetery Ridge trying to hold on. Meade was a cautious, methodical man, not glamorous, not beloved, but deeply competent. He rode the length of his lines in the early morning, studying the fishhook-shaped ridge his men occupied. Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill formed the barb. Cemetery Ridge ran south, the long straight shank. At the bottom, barely held, barely manned, were 2 rocky hills, Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Meade sent orders. Men moved. Engineers pointed. The great Federal war machine began to orient itself. But there was a problem, a serious, dangerous problem, and it was coming from within his own command. Daniel Sickles makes his move. General Daniel Sickles was not a professional soldier. He was a New York politician, flamboyant, reckless, brilliant in his own way, and deeply dangerous in the way that charismatic men who believe they know better than everyone else are dangerous. He commanded the 3rd Corps, positioned at the left center of the Union line, and on the morning of July 2, he was deeply unhappy with his assigned position. Meade had placed the 3rd Corps on the southern end of Cemetery Ridge, their left flank connecting with the 2nd Corps to the north. It was a logical, defensible position. But Sickles, riding forward to survey the ground, became fixated on a slight ridge near the Emmitsburg Road, a half-mile in front of the main Union line, near a peach orchard and a wheat field. That ground was higher, he reasoned. Better fields of fire. Better for artillery. He sent word to Meade asking permission to advance. Meade said no. Sickles, with the confidence of a man who had once shot his wife's lover in Lafayette Square and been acquitted, ignored the order. Around 2 p.m., Daniel Sickles moved the entire 3rd Corps, approximately 10,000 men, forward to the Peach Orchard salient. He had created an advanced position that jutted out from the Union main line, isolated, unsupported on both flanks, and directly in the path of Longstreet's oncoming assault. When Meade galloped down to see what was happening and found his flank dangling in space, his response was reportedly close to explosion. "Your line cannot be maintained," he shouted. "You will be crushed." Sickles stared back and offered to withdraw. Before Meade could answer, the Confederate guns opened up. Act 3, Hell opens. 4 p.m., the Confederate assault begins. The artillery speaks. At approximately 4 p.m., Confederate Colonel Edward Porter Alexander ordered his artillery to open fire. Dozens of guns along the Emmitsburg Road erupted simultaneously, sending iron screaming across the valley. The Union batteries around the Peach Orchard answered back. For several minutes, the two sides hurled metal at each other in a roar that could be heard 40 miles away. Then the Gray Infantry came. Hood's division, on the Confederate right, pushed north and east toward the rocky wilderness of Devil's Den and the base of the Round Tops. McLaws' division, in the center, came straight for the Peach Orchard and the wheat field. The attack rolled forward like a wave, and Sickles' advanced, isolated corps stood directly in its path. The fighting that followed was some of the most savage, close-quarters combat of the entire Civil War. Devil's Den, the rocks that drank blood. At the base of Little Round Top, a tumble of massive granite boulders created a natural fortress the soldiers called Devil's Den. Confederate sharpshooters from Texas and Georgia pushed into the rocks, crawling between boulders 10 feet high, finding firing positions with overlapping fields of fire that could pick off soldiers hundreds of yards away. Union troops from the 3rd Corps fought back, using the rocks themselves as weapons, rolling boulders down slopes, firing from crevices so narrow only one man at a time could stand. The fighting was not a battle of lines and formations here. It was men against men, almost hand-to-hand, the outcome decided by who was willing to climb one more rock, advance 10 more yards into the killing ground. By late afternoon, Confederate forces had taken Devil's Den. Their sharpshooters settled in among the rocks and began the methodical, terrible work of picking off Union officers and artillerymen on the slopes above. The position was won, but the price had been enormous. The wheat field runs red. A half-mile north of Devil's Den, across an open wheat field that had been golden and peaceful just that morning, the fighting became a meat grinder. The wheat field changed hands 6 times on the afternoon of July 2, 1863. 6 times Union and Confederate soldiers charged across the same ground, fought among the same broken stalks of grain, died in the same rows where farmers had planted seed in spring. Regiments from Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama pushed into the field and were driven back. Fresh Union brigades counterattacked and were shattered. Officers fell by the dozen. Men who had never fired a gun in anger 18 months before stood and shot at each other across distances of 40 yards, sometimes less. By the end of the afternoon, the wheat field was carpeted in blue and gray. Thousands of men had fallen in an area smaller than a football field. The grain was gone, crushed under boots and bodies, and what had replaced it was something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Sickles falls. In the chaos of the peach orchard, General Daniel Sickles had his moment of awful reckoning. He was mounted among his men, trying to rally the Third Corps as it bent and buckled under the Confederate assault, when a Confederate artillery shell struck his right leg just below the knee. The leg was shattered. Surgeons would amputate it within the hour. Sickles was carried from the field on a stretcher, reportedly smoking a cigar to show his men he was not dying, a theatrical gesture that was entirely in character. He would survive. He would live to be 94 years old. And for the rest of his long life, he would insist that his unauthorized advance had actually saved the Union Army by absorbing the Confederate assault before it could reach the main line. Historians have argued about this ever since. Some agree. Most do not. What is beyond argument is that the Third Corps had been destroyed as a fighting force, that the Union left flank was now wide open, and that Longstreet's men were moving directly toward the unguarded slopes of Little Round Top. Act 4. The race for Little Round Top, 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. The empty hill. Little Round Top was, at that moment, almost completely empty of Union soldiers. The rocky, forested hill that commanded the entire left flank of the Union Army, the hill that, if taken with artillery, could enfilade the entire length of Cemetery Ridge and potentially end the battle, end the campaign, perhaps end the war, had approximately one signal officer on it, waving flags. His name was Lieutenant Gouverneur Warren, the Army of the Potomac's chief engineer. Warren had ridden up to Little Round Top to observe the fighting below, and what he saw horrified him. As Confederate forces poured around the Union left, he understood with sudden, sickening clarity that if they reached the top of this hill before Union infantry could be rushed forward, the day, and possibly much more, was lost. Warren did not wait for orders. He galloped down the hill and grabbed the 1st Brigade he could find. Vincent's brigade runs. Colonel Strong Vincent commanded a brigade of 4 regiments from the 5th Corps. He was 26 years old, Harvard-educated, and possessed of the kind of calm certainty under pressure that separates leaders who are remembered from those who are forgotten. When Warren rode up and told him the Round Top was unoccupied, Vincent did not ask for written orders or wait for his division commander to be found. He looked at the hill, looked at the Confederate troops moving toward it, and made a decision in seconds. "I will take responsibility for moving my brigade there," he said. Vincent's 4 regiments, the 16th Michigan, 44th New York, 83rd Pennsylvania, and 20th Maine, ran. They scrambled up the rocky slopes of Little Round Top at a near run, positioning themselves along the southern face of the hill just minutes, possibly seconds, before Confederate forces began their assault from below. Vincent himself would not survive the day. A Confederate bullet would strike him on the hip as he stood on the summit, urging his men forward. He would die a week later. But his decision, instant, unauthorized, correct, had placed those 4 regiments on the hill in time to hold it. The 20th Maine and the end of the line. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment was placed at the far left end of Vincent's line, and therefore the far left end of the entire Union Army. He was given the most critical and most isolated position on the battlefield. Vincent's instructions were clear: you are the extreme left of the entire Union line. You must hold this position at all costs. If you are flanked, the entire army will be rolled up. Chamberlain was a professor from Bowdoin College who had taught rhetoric in modern languages. He had no formal military training. He had learned tactics from books and from 18 months of hard fighting. And now he stood on the rocky southern slope of Little Round Top with 358 men. His regiment had begun the campaign with 1,000, but disease and battle had worn it thin, and waited for what was coming. What was coming was the 15th Alabama Infantry, commanded by Colonel William Oates, nearly 500 men who had just finished a brutal march in the July heat without water. They were exhausted, thirsty, and they came up the slope of Little Round Top like a force of nature. 5 charges. The 15th Alabama charged the 20th Maine 5 times. 5 times Oates' men came screaming up the wooded slope, firing as they came, closing to within feet of the Union line before being driven back by volleys and hand-to-hand fighting. Each charge left more men on the slope. Each time the Confederates came back, fewer men came with them. Each charge was also a crisis for Chamberlain. His men were running out of ammunition. Some were down to their last few rounds. The regiment had been stretched so thin across the slope that in some places there were gaps that Oates' men came terrifyingly close to exploiting. Chamberlain moved along his line in the smoke and noise, shifting men, shouting encouragement, occasionally grabbing a rifle and firing himself when he found a gap. After the 5th charge, there was a brief, terrible pause. The smoke drifted. Both sides looked at each other across the blood-soaked hillside. Chamberlain's men had almost nothing left. His left was wavering. One more charge, and they would break. Chamberlain made a decision that military historians still study and debate and marvel at. Fix bayonets. Bayonet. Forward to the right. Chamberlain ordered. The command was unconventional to the point of madness. His men were out of ammunition, exhausted, outnumbered. The standard option, the logical option, was to withdraw, to give ground, to try to survive. Instead, Chamberlain ordered a charge. Not a straight charge down the hill, but a wheeling movement, the left of his line swinging forward while the right held, pivoting the entire regiment like a gate swinging open, crashing into the Alabamians from the front and flank simultaneously. The effect was electric. The 20th Maine came over the rocks with bayonets fixed and let out a yell that witnesses described as something between a battle cry and a scream of pure desperation. The exhausted, stunned 15th Alabama, already rocked by 5 failed charges, already bleeding, already thirsty beyond endurance, collapsed. Men surrendered by the dozens. Others fled down the slope. The 20th Maine captured over 400 Confederate prisoners. Little Round Top held. It was one of the most celebrated acts of military improvisation in American history. Act 5, The Peach Orchard and the Breaking of the Third Corps, 4 to 7 p.m. McLaws hits the salient. While the drama on Little Round Top was reaching its climax, the rest of Longstreet's assault was tearing through Sickles' exposed salient at the Peach Orchard with brutal efficiency. McLaws' division, Georgians, South Carolinians, Mississippians, came through the orchards and the cornfields with Confederate yells that soldiers who survived the day would hear in their dreams for decades. The Peach Orchard itself became a killing ground. Artillery positions changed hands in fighting so close that gunners used their sponge staffs as clubs. Union batteries that had been placed forward to maximize their field of fire were now surrounded on 3 sides, their horses shot, their men falling, unable to withdraw. Battery after battery was lost. The Third Corps, which Sickles had pushed forward with such confidence a few hours earlier, was being systematically destroyed. The Second Corps plugs the gap. Meade, watching the catastrophe unfold from Cemetery Ridge, did what good generals do in emergencies. He stripped his other positions and threw men into the gap. Hancock's Second Corps, the Iron Corps, the most reliable in the army, was pulled apart and its brigades flung southward to fill the holes being torn by the Confederate advance. Caldwell's division went into the wheat field and bought precious time at terrible cost. Humphrey's division on the Emmitsburg Road fought a fighting withdrawal that was as tactically brilliant as it was bloody. Brigade by brigade, regiment by regiment, the Union Army bent and bent but refused to break, each new unit buying the next a few more minutes, a few more yards. The sun moved. The shadows grew longer. The guns never stopped. Act 6, Ewell's Missed Opportunity and the Night and Culp's Hill, Dusk and Beyond. Cemetery Hill almost falls. Lee's plan for July 2nd had called for a coordinated assault, Longstreet attacking the Union left while Ewell's Second Corps attacked Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill from the north and east. The idea was to stretch the Union line until something snapped. But coordination was the Confederate Army's persistent weakness on this day. Ewell launched his attack late, after Longstreet had already been fighting for hours. Confederate brigades under Hayes and Avery came up the slopes of Cemetery Hill just as the sun was setting, and they nearly took it. Union gunners, running low on canister, actually wheeled their guns around and fired into Confederate infantry at point-blank range. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted around the stone walls. For a few wild minutes, it looked as though the barb of the Union fishhook might be seized. But Union reinforcements arrived. The Confederates, having climbed the hill with tremendous courage and terrible losses, found themselves on the slopes without the support they needed. Ewell could not coordinate his supporting brigades in time. The Confederates were driven back down the hill in the darkness. Culp's Hill, the night fight. On Culp's Hill, to the east of Cemetery Hill, the fighting continued after dark, an eerie, terrifying night battle fought by men who could see almost nothing, who fired at muzzle flashes in the blackness, who sometimes did not know until they shouted whether the men beside them were friends or enemies. Johnson's Confederate division had actually captured empty Union breastworks on Culp's Hill. Union troops had been pulled away to reinforce the embattled left, but they could not exploit the position before nightfall. The entrenchments they held were a promise of what might have been, not what was. As midnight approached and the guns finally fell silent one by one, the Army of Northern Virginia had fought one of the most aggressive, ferocious days of the entire war, and had almost nothing to show for it. The Union line had bent everywhere. It had broken nowhere. The Reckoning. Chapter 20, What the Night Counted. In the darkness after the battle, men from both sides moved through the fields and woods looking for their wounded. The cries were constant, a chorus of suffering that stretched from the Peach Orchard to the Round Tops, from Devil's Den to Culp's Hill. Surgeons worked by lantern light, their tools moving without pause, the sounds of their work carrying in the humid night air. The Union Army had suffered approximately 9,000 casualties on July 2. The Confederate Army had suffered roughly the same. 20,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, more casualties than the United States had suffered in the entire Mexican-American War, and the battle was not yet over. One more day remained. Lee sat in his headquarters tent and considered the situation with the focused, unsentimental clarity that made him the general he was. The Union left had held. Cemetery Hill had held. Culp's Hill had almost fallen. The center, Cemetery Ridge, had not been tested. Perhaps the center was weakened now, stripped of men to shore up the flanks. Perhaps one massive assault, straight up the middle, could split the Union Army and end this. He began to plan what would become known to history as Pickett's Charge. The meaning of July 2. The second day of Gettysburg was, in many ways, a battle decided by mistakes, and by the men who corrected them. Johnston's faulty reconnaissance set everything in motion. Longstreet's delay cost the Confederates the element of surprise. Sickles' unauthorized advance created a crisis that nearly broke the Union Army. But Warren's instinct sent Vincent's brigade running to Little Round Top. Chamberlain's improvisation saved the Union left. Meade's steady hand, pulling men from one crisis to feed another, held the line together through 5 brutal hours. The Union had not won. The battle would go on. But on July 2, 1863, the Army of the Potomac proved something about itself and about the men who made it up, farmers from Maine, clerks from Pennsylvania, immigrants from New York and Ohio, that no reconnaissance report, no faulty intelligence, no strategic miscalculation could erase. When pushed to the edge, when ammunition was gone and legs were spent and the men beside you were falling, they did not run. They fixed bayonets, and they charged. America would remember this day for as long as it remembered itself.